Dobry wieczór.
Good evening and welcome. Welcome to Rialto, our cinema theatre. This is 78th meeting of the Club of Ecological Thought, and I'm Piotr Skuba, biologist, ecologist at the University of Silesia, Ecological Thinking Club. Ryszard Kulik, I am a psychologist. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We have a very unique meeting. It will be translated into the Polish language from English, and I would like to remind you that those who want to follow the translation, they can collect their headsets for simultaneous interpretation on the right hand side of the entrance. Yes, we are very glad to be back here to Rialto, and most of you will know this because you have attended so many meetings over all these years. We have been hosting them, and now we are back. This is the 78th meeting, a very unique one with a guest from abroad, and ladies and gentlemen, soon we will have been marking the 11th anniversary of the Ecological Thinking Club. It all started back in January 2012, the 78th meeting now, and we are working with the Upper Silesian and Dąbrowa Basin Metropolis. As you can see, the banner, the Metropolis, is actually accompanying us on this journey and supporting us very strongly. We have another partner supporting us equally strongly, the University of Silesia in Katowice. And the three of us, we have been preparing these meetings and organizing them. And today, as Piotr has been kind enough to mention, our guest has flown to us from Canada, Professor Martin Head. Let's give him a big hand to welcome him.
Tak, pan profesor z Kanady.
So, he's coming here all the way from Canada. He works at Brock University in Canada, but also at the University of Toronto and the Wolfson College at Cambridge. And Anthropocene, this is a theme which is dear to him. He is a stratigrapher. He's a professor of earth sciences, a biologist, as we can read in the bios. He is fascinated by stratigraphy of quaternary and climate reconstructions and the impact of human activity on the natural environment. He specializes in analysis of marine dinoflagellates. These are algae, and they've been accumulating on ocean bottoms for many years, and this will be a topic of our conversations. He has been active in a disciplinary work group for, yes, exactly, Anthropocene working group, and he's been fighting, so to speak, to make sure that this term Anthropocene makes a fixed presence in science, in also what students learn at school, but also in research and academia. So if I may add to this, Martin Head is currently the vice chairman of the International Commission for Quaternary Stratigraphy, and he used to be the chair of that commission, and he's also the vice chairman of the working group for the boundary of between Pleistocene and Holocene, and then also he is a member of numerous commissions and committees, bodies, and he's been showing great commitment in terms of analyzing the impact of humans on the ecosystem, and he combines the point of view of the sciences of geology with reflection of the human sciences. And so today is not only about hard data and about a lecture by a geologist, but this will also be a reflection on the kind of world we will be living in, we are living in, and what can be done about it. What is particularly dear to me, and I would like to say these words to Martin, that he combines the human sciences with sciences as such, and and
w dzisiejszych czasach.
so humanities and sciences, and so as not to, limit oneself to one's backyard, but to actually reach out and have a broader message and reach out to the humanities. So, the professor is a guest of the Institute of Geological Sciences in Krakow.
Panowskiego Instytutu.
The Polish Academy of Sciences Institute, and he has already had a lecture at the University of Warsaw yesterday or the day before yesterday, and he is here tonight. And so the presence of the professor has been made possible by the excellent ladies from the
Dziękujemy.
Institute of Geological Sciences. Thank you, Małgorzata Lempart-Rossi. She's with us tonight, and she works with the professor. And so, thanks to her, this is possible. And Wiesława Radmacher, also a PhD, they do actually similar work to the professor, and it so happens it is a great thing that we can host this here and we can have the professor with us. And today's meeting will be held in the following way. We'll give the floor to Professor Head in a while. He will hold his lecture, his presentation, which will last about 45 minutes, followed by me and Piotr chatting with the professor here for a while. And after that, we will give the floor over to you and to the guests who have gathered here with us online. Asia Wojtaszek is watching over the questions that will be appearing there, and there will be an opportunity for you to talk about these things with the professor. So it's not only about us. And now the time has come, I believe, to give the floor to Professor Martin J. Head. And please, let's get the presentation rolling.
Professor Martin, stage is yours. Antropocen, reakcja systemu ziemskiego na działalność człowieka. Zapraszamy.
I was asked if I would like to hear a translation of the introduction. I said, no, it's okay, I trust you. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and my first time in Katowice, and I'm here to share my thoughts and my take on the Anthropocene. But this is from a geological perspective, and I'll explain how this differs actually in some ways from other kinds of approach. So let's begin then with the first slide. So I shall talk about the Anthropocene in terms of the evolution of an idea. The Great Acceleration. The Great Acceleration is an extremely important, central concept to the, if you like, the geological Anthropocene. And it refers to the planetary responses to human impacts. There's a big difference here between human impacts and the way these impacts have modified the Earth system. I'll be talking about different geological approaches to the Anthropocene. There is no single geological approach to the Anthropocene, and I shall explain the different approaches even within geology. And I'll be talking about proposing the Anthropocene as a geological time unit. So this is somewhat technical, so I will need to go through some of the technicalities with you, but I will be doing this very gently so that we all kind of, follow what needs to be done. This is important because it serves to provide constraints on how we actually define the Anthropocene, or how we can define the Anthropocene. Let's begin with the different kinds of approaches that we use. There's geology. With geology, we are essentially reconstructing past environments using geological records. These geological records can be the rock record, the sediment record, the ice core record, tree rings, speleothems, and so on. So that's geology. We're in the business of reconstructing the past. And then there is Earth system science, which studies the Earth as an integrated dynamic system. It allows projections, not predictions, but projections, or not forecasts, but projections of future climate. And then there is chronostratigraphy. And chronostratigraphy is a branch of geology. And it's the chronostratigraphic approach that I'm going to be explaining to you this evening. Essentially, with chronostratigraphy, we are classifying rocks, sediments, and other geological records by their geological age. And the results of chronostratigraphy and the chronostratigraphic approach, the results and the product of that enterprise is the geological timescale. It's called the International Chronostratigraphic Chart, but it's basically the International Geological Timescale. You can see that it's made up of units, and these units occur in a ranked fashion, so it is a hierarchical timescale. And the units themselves, at their different ranks, are defined by international agreement. International agreement means that there have to be rules, and those rules have to be followed. I want to spend a short period of time acknowledging that there is more than one kind of Anthropocene. There's more than one kind of geological Anthropocene. There are many different kinds of Anthropocene. And depending on whether you're talking to a historian, a philosopher, an archaeologist, an anthropologist, a physical or a human geographer, and so on, depending on who you're talking to, the meaning of Anthropocene will change. My talk will be on the chronostratigraphic Anthropocene. In other words, our efforts to define the Anthropocene as a new unit of the geological timescale. It is relevant, it is actually highly relevant to begin with the origins of the term Anthropocene. And then the Anthropocene as a term was coined by Paul Crutzen, who was an atmospheric chemist. He died a couple of years ago. He was an atmospheric chemist and a Nobel laureate. He got his Nobel Prize from work on the ozone layer and the ozone hole. And he was at a meeting. I'll come on to this later, but it basically is from the Earth system community. Not a geologist, Earth system community, an Earth system scientist. And he introduced the term to emphasize the central role of mankind in geology and ecology by proposing the term Anthropocene for, this is the crucial bit, for the current geological epoch. Now, the current geological epoch is actually the Holocene. Well, we'll come on to that in the next slide, but what does the Anthropocene, in terms of its etymology, what does that mean to us in the earth sciences? Well, of course, anthropos is Greek and it means human. And kainos, also Greek, means new or recent. So Anthropocene, if you Latinize the kainos to scene, basically Anthropocene literally means modern or recent human, which is pretty apt. But Charles Lyell, famous geologist back in the 19th century, in 1833, he proposed new units of the geological timescale. This is probably the earliest hierarchical geological timescale ever published, in 1855 by Charles Lyell. And you can see he introduced the terms Eocene, Miocene, and Pliocene. Well, since then, we've added new units to the upper part of the geological timescale. So now we have, and I'm just wondering if with these lights here, whether you can see the screen or not. Maybe it would be an idea to dim some of those lights. Anyway, I'll leave that to you. But we have, so we have Paleocene, Eocene, Oligocene, Miocene, Pliocene and Pleistocene, and right at the very top we have Holocene. So the thing is this, that to a geologist, Anthropocene signals a formal unit of geological time. It follows that etymological tradition. So to us, in geology, Anthropocene is naturally a geological term, and it was introduced, it was intended to be that way by Paul Crutzen, notwithstanding my acknowledgement that the term Anthropocene is used by other constituencies to mean other things. So, essentially then, we are living today, this is the official time scale, we are living in the Holocene. It began 11,700 years ago, it's continuing on. It's with us in the present day and it will continue into the future. That's where we are now. According to Paul Crutzen, who was at a meeting in the year 2000, and he said, stop using the term Holocene. We're no longer in the Holocene, we're in the Anthropocene. So that really is how the term was born. According to Crutzen, and those people who feel there is justification for a chronostratigraphic Anthropocene, then it would appear here terminating the Holocene. So I'll come on to this later, but we would draw the line at 1950, and I'll explain why in the coming slides. Okay, so this all happened within the Earth system community. Geologists didn't get involved in this until 2008, when Jan Zalasiewicz and Colin Waters wrote an article which appeared in GSA Today in 2008. Are we living in the Anthropocene? And as a result of that provocative title and article, it was suggested that these two co-authors set up a working group to look into whether there was geological reality, some real geological sense in having the Anthropocene as a new unit. This is the geological timescale again. Now, one of the crucial things about the geological timescale I've mentioned already is that it is subdivided into these units. Well, an intrinsic feature of these units, these geological time units, is that they need to be defined at their base by something called a global boundary stratotype section and point. I did say there was going to be some technicalities here. I'm keeping them to a minimum, but you do need to know what a GSSP is. And a GSSP is basically a global standard that is designated somewhere in the world in the rock record, and it defines the base of every unit on that time scale. The GSSP is essentially also defining a timeline, which means that each unit of the time scale has a base that is isochronous. It's the same age right the way around the entire globe. The top of each unit is defined by the base of the superjacent unit, so there can be no gaps in the record. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, that's still very well, but what does a GSSP look like? Well, they can look like this. This is a GSSP plaque. that has been placed at one of these GSSPs, internationally designated. This happens to be, I think, the Coniacian stage within the Cretaceous. It's representing the base of a chronostratigraphic unit, one of those units on the time scale. And this defines, if you like, an isochronous base. Okay, the base of that unit will be the same age all around the globe. That is an intrinsic property of the time scale. Now, in order for there to be international recognition and acceptance and buy-in of this sort of scheme, it has to have international authority, and that authority comes from the committee structure that finally approves these decisions on GSSPs. So we start off with a working group, in this case the Anthropocene Working Group, set up by Jan Zalasevich and Colin Waters. So the Anthropocene Working Group then decides upon a candidate GSSP among several, and then that one candidate selected by the Anthropocene Working Group as a proposal goes up to the next stage, which is the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy. If it's approved at that subcommission level, it goes up to the full International Commission on Stratigraphy, which then hopefully would approve that proposal, and then finally it goes up to the executive committee of the International Union of Geological Sciences, which then hopefully would ratify that approval. Once that happens, it's in the geological time scale and it is official. It can take years for this to happen. But it needs to be very rigorous and it has to be very meticulously detailed throughout those various processes. One of the questions is, when did the chronostratigraphic Anthropocene begin? Well, Crutzen suggested the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, which seemed like a good idea at the time, but the problem is that, well, it's very Eurocentric, isn't it? But a bigger problem is that if this is going to be a geological time unit, well, then the stratigraphic signals associated with the base of the Anthropocene need to be distributed and recognized globally. So it wasn't really ideal, because we all know that the Industrial Revolution happened at different places at different times around the globe. It didn't start in Japan until, the 1860s. We now use, and I'm jumping the gun a bit here, we use the Great Acceleration from the mid-20th century. And the Great Acceleration is an upturn in many socio-economic drivers and Earth systems trends, stimulated, it just so happens, by World War II. Let's look into a little more detail about the Great Acceleration. It's important because it justifies the chronostratigraphic Anthropocene. It justifies it in terms of the timing of its inception and in terms of its rank at the epoch level, which would then justify termination of the Holocene beneath. It essentially arose from data analysis by Will Stephan, who is an Earth systems scientist. He discovered these human drivers of climate change, and they all began with an inflection upwards or deflection upwards in the mid-20th century. These are the so-called Great Acceleration curves. They led to an overwhelming of the planetary regulation system. These are the Great Acceleration curves. They include population, real GDP, primary energy use. These are the socioeconomic drivers of planetary change, and the indicators of planetary change are the Earth system trends, which include carbon dioxide and methane and so on, the greenhouse gases. In 2005, at a conference organized by Will Steffen in Dahlem in Germany, there was a meeting to discuss these Earth systems trends, and the workshop included a mixed group of social scientists, natural scientists, and humanities scholars. They were all involved in these discussions. Now, the geologists and the Earth system scientists were astonished to discover that there were these major upturns in the mid-20th century, just after World War II. It was assumed that these changes had occurred gradually since the Industrial Revolution. But for the historians who had already been studying societal change over the 20th century, they weren't surprised at all. They could see that this had already happened. One of these historians, by the name of John R. McNeill, an American historian, coined the term, the Great Acceleration. He coined the term Great Acceleration in reference to Karl Polanyi's societal analysis called the Great Transformation. So he just, borrowed that phrase and called it the Great Acceleration. John McNeill had written the important, influential book, Something New Under the Sun, which was an environmental history of the 20th century. So he was well poised to really appreciate these great acceleration curves. I might just say that the term Great Acceleration has caused some misunderstanding in certain sectors of the scientific community who, for some reason, have, perhaps understandably, have taken the Great Acceleration to be a literal term. This is not a literal acceleration, this is a figurative term to describe the fact that these socio-economic indicators and Earth systems trends are following a sharp upturn around about 1950. Not meant to be tested by mathematical analysis, but sure enough, somebody did just that, and there was really no point to it. Okay, I've mentioned that already. Okay, so back now to geology again. The Anthropocene Working Group were very well aware of the Great Acceleration as a result of the publicity from the Earth system community. From an analysis of the geological signals, they realized that the geological, the chronostratigraphic Anthropocene works best if it is defined in the mid-20th century, because that's where the geological signals all are. And they analyzed these signals in the geological record, and they summarized the geological evidence, the stratigraphic evidence, in this book, The Anthropocene as a Geological Time Unit. And so it was from this point on that geology, chronostratigraphy, and Earth system science then became synced together. Among the geological stratigraphic signals that they discovered include novel mineral-like compounds, more than 180,000 new compounds appearing in the mid-20th century. This is all to do with technological innovation, of course. Fly ash, and we're dealing here with essentially with a globalization signal. So this is not just technological innovation, it is globalization of technology and industry. Fly ash, including these things here, spheroidal carbonaceous particles, very, very distinctive, and they travel great distances. They're produced by power stations, the combustion of fossil fuels at very high temperature. And these things are minute. They can be 10 to 50 microns across. They're minute. They travel in the atmosphere over great distances. They can even be found in pristine environments in Antarctica. Black carbon, microplastics, also very important indicators of the mid-20th century and onwards. Metals such as aluminum, so plastics, for example, with if you like, a geological record starting around 1950. Aluminum production. Aluminum doesn't occur as an element, as a metal naturally, but you start finding it from about 1950 onwards with huge production figures continuing to the present day. Chemical signals, stable isotopes, radiogenic isotopes caused by nuclear and thermonuclear weapons testing. And biotic signals, extinctions, but especially translocations, with global travel increasing after World War II. So more and more species were being moved around the globe. There was a homogenization of biodiversity as a result of the events associated with the Great Acceleration. So these are all geological stratigraphic indicators that would allow geologists today or in the future to recognize the Anthropocene just from the sediments alone, with a very clear geological signal around the year 1950. If we go back to, let's say, the rationale or the background cause of all this, of course, it is this great increase in productivity, an increase in, of course, in the numbers of people, population, and we can look at these indicators here quantitatively. Here's 1950, and you can see sharp rises in global population. Not just sharp rises, but enormous magnitudes of change as well. You know, more than a doubling of population since 1950. Global energy consumption, the planet has been undergoing a huge energy burn since around the 1950s. That continues to the present day. And global productivity, which of course is, in a sense, it's kind of fueling everything else. If we look at CO2, which is one of the most important greenhouse gases, we see that just around about 1950, there is a sharp increase, and that increase continues to the present day. The present CO2 concentrations, well, not the present, but in May of this year, the CO2 concentrations had reached 221, I think it was, just over 421 parts per billion. This is the highest, and this is after the pandemic, this is the highest CO2 levels have ever been in human recorded history. So that's a sharp change at around 1950, but not all changes are going to be sustained. Let's take fishing, for example. There are certain indicators that are not going to keep rising because there are finite resources. In the case of fish, in spite of the expression, there are plenty more fish in the sea. There are actually not. There are diminishing numbers of fish in the sea, and so we're starting to see a drop in fish yields. although of course it started around the 1950s, but it can't be sustained. No acceleration can carry on indefinitely. In the case of temperature rise, temperature has a complicated relationship with CO2. Although CO2 is a major driver, you have to remember that a great deal of heat is stored in the oceans. Plus, just after the Second World War, before clean air legislation came in, a lot of, well, there are a number of ways to explain the delay, but there is a delay between, if you like, the heating up of the planet and surface temperature, which started to rise in around about the 1970s, but of course continues. Aerosol production after World War II is one potential cause, but storage of heat in the oceans is another. The magnitudes of change are really important, not just the rate of change. Take cement. Cement is a really important factor in the geological Anthropocene for three reasons. Firstly, when you are making cement, you are creating a lot of CO2, which is a potent greenhouse gas. You increase sediment fluxes because of all the quarrying that is needed to produce the raw materials for the cement and the concrete. This produces large amounts of sediment, which finds its way into rivers and gets trapped behind dams or in the shallow marine zone and so on. So you're changing geological processes, in fact. And of course, cement itself and concrete produces a very enduring product of the Anthropocene, cement, which is very, very durable and long-lasting on geological timescales. If we look here, we can see a huge increase in cement, vast increase compared with 1950. But it tails off about 2014, 2015. But even though it tails off, it's still the growth rates are still maintained. They're still positive. And you have a cumulative effect in terms of all these processes and effects that I've just described. It's cumulative. There are massive amounts of cement and concrete that have accumulated since 1950, not to mention all these other sort of side effects, CO2 and so on, which are also cumulative. Let's look now at CO2, and we'll look at methane as well, two very important drivers of climate change. In the case of atmospheric CO2, levels now are at 146% of Holocene levels. And by Holocene, I mean sort of pre-industrial times. And basically here is CO2. This is your standard kind of hockey stick curve at the end. CO2 is just going up through the roof. So essentially this is telling us that we've escaped, if you like, the envelope of normal change within the Holocene. We're into something different. You can do the same thing with methane as well. So these are methane concentrations. Atmospheric methane, 257% of Holocene levels. I should say that in terms of atmospheric CO2, the levels that we've now reached are as high or higher than they've been in the past 3 million years. We're talking about massive increases in CO2. In the case of methane, the levels now are higher than they've been in the last 800,000 years at least. This is using ice core records that go back 800,000 years. CO2 levels may be higher than, much more than 800,000, but at least 800,000 years. And these all contribute fundamentally to rapid changes in the Earth system. We can use these indicators, especially CO2, to provide projections into the future using modeling. And the best models available tell us that CO2, which has high longevity in the atmosphere, unlike methane, CO2 is kind of here to stay. It's around for a long time. This, together with the fact that the orbital configuration of the planet is such that we're not likely to see a glacial stage for at least 50,000 years, probably 100,000 years, and possibly 500,000 years. Now, I don't personally think that we're going to be able to sustain these levels of CO2 at the vast levels we're producing them, because we've already crossed the threshold. Things are only going to get critically worse. But even if we scale back significantly, and we can do this by, for example, sequestration of CO2, sucking CO2 somehow out of the atmosphere, ocean alkalization and fertilization to cause microbes and small plankton within the oceans to capture CO2 and cause it to sink to the bottom. Whatever we do, we will have changed and modified the climate to the point where we are no longer within the, if you like, the natural realm of climate over geological time. We will have moved into a new phase. Basically, a human-managed future climate at best. So I'm not sure how well you can see this particular diagram, but it's showing the Earth in its Holocene trajectory, and then either heading towards a hothouse Earth or into a kind of a responsible stewardship kind of a mode here. I think we're probably already beyond the possibility of responsible stewardship. That bus left a long time ago, but I think there is still some hope. But we are definitely into the realm of, the need for modifications to the climate system. I did say I'd talk about a different kind of geological approach, and one of them is an approach that says the Anthropocene is not a geological, is not a formal geological epoch, it is an event. A couple of papers came out over the past 2 years. So even within the geological community, there is not perfect agreement on what we mean by the Anthropocene. According to the geological event approach, this would be the aggregated effects of human activities that are transforming the Earth system. Okay, well, that's fair enough so far, but it goes on to say it incorporates various historical and social processes, for example, urbanization, colonial violence, industrialization, capitalist production. This is all fine, but this is not geology. This is actually an interdisciplinary approach, which may be absolutely fine, but it's not geology, and it doesn't need to be a replacement. It can work in parallel with a chronostratigraphic Anthropocene. Why you would call this particular meaning, why you would call it Anthropocene, I don't know. They don't explain why they even use the word. We would talk about an anthropogenic episode instead. And this could exist in parallel with an Anthropocene as defined chronostratigraphically. And this is in fact how we have proposed that these different geological concepts be handled. The so-called geological event, with some modifications to the definition, would be an anthropogenic episode, or an anthropogenic modification episode. but we can use the event approach to actually define a chronostratigraphic Anthropocene aligned with the mid-20th century. I did say that in order for the chronostratigraphic Anthropocene to be defined, it has to have a GSSP, and the Anthropocene Working Group is considering 12, as many as 12, potential candidates. And they are scattered around the world. I won't go through them all, but they represent different geological environments, shallow marine environments, lake environments, ice cores, speleothems, and so on, peat deposits. And different groups have been working on these different potential candidates. The Anthropocene Working Group is considering these 12 candidates as I speak. And at the end of the month, there will be a vote ultimately on which one candidate will go on to the next step. I'm just going to say something about one candidate, give you an idea of how this all kind of pans out, what these proposals look like. This is Crawford Lake in Canada. I happen to be involved in this particular proposal, so although this is confidential, I am at liberty to share this with you. I won't describe these curves in detail, but they are stratigraphic curves essentially, and they are detailing the change from, if you like, the Holocene to the Anthropocene over time. And this is possible because Crawford Lake is annually laminated, so we can look at every annual lamination and we can analyze it for geological signals. Now, the Anthropocene is only, 72 years in duration, but we can nonetheless get a tremendous amount of information out of these geological deposits. Again, I don't need to go into the details, but I will just point out that one particular signal does stand out from the others. The plutonium-239-240 signature here, that's the plutonium signal. That results from nuclear and thermonuclear fallout, weapons testing in the mid-20th century. And this signal is a global signal. We can recognize this signal all around the world in a variety of different depositional environments. So it is a perfect stratigraphic indicator, all right? And so this would be considered a very important indicator for the Anthropocene. It's not intended to have any symbolic significance. It is simply empirically a stratigraphic signal that helps us recognize the Anthropocene globally. Okay, so where did the money come from to produce all these analyses? It's expensive to do this kind of work. Well, improbably enough, it was the arts community that funded this important scientific work. The Haus Kulturen der Welt in Berlin provided 800,000 euros, almost €1 million, to the Anthropocene Working Group to fund a lot of this critical analytical work. As a result of this partnering with the House, the Anthropocene Working Group will announce, if you like, the winner, the voted candidate for the Anthropocene in December of this year, and it will be announced at the House itself. There'll be a big ceremony and all the rest of it. But what next? Okay, so the Anthropocene Working Group then will submit a proposal. There's the Anthropocene Working Group. It'll submit a proposal to the SQS, the Subcommission for Quaternary Stratigraphy. But then the Subcommission for Quaternary Stratigraphy is then obliged to hold open discussions on the Anthropocene, open discussions within and beyond the geoscience community. This is to provide important feedback from other people, from other scholarly enterprises, because many more people than just simply geologists use the geological timescale. As importantly, it allows the voting members of the SQS, who would be voting on this one proposal, either for or against, it will allow these voting members to be educated on the various aspects of the Anthropocene. Now, there would be two votes. One would be on whether or not the preferred candidate is voted as a GSSP, but also on the rank, whether the rank be at the level of epoch or whether it be just at a lower rank of stage. And that has important consequences for the terminology, as I'll explain. The recommendations of the SQS then go to the ICS, the International Commission on Stratigraphy, for approval and final ratification by the Executive Committee of the International Union of Geological Sciences. It's important to understand that all voting within this process requires a 60% supermajority for that proposal to go to the next stage and to be finally ratified. Okay, what are the potential outcomes here? Well, from my perspective, the best outcome is that the Anthropocene is approved along with its corresponding stage. Let's just say, for argument's sake, the Crawford Lake proposal is the winning proposal. Then we would have the Crawfordian stage, and it would simultaneously define the Anthropocene, and the Anthropocene would be approved at the rank of epoch. That would be, from my perspective, the ideal solution. The practical consequences of that is that the onset would be defined in 1950. You'd have a stabilization of the definition of Anthropocene within the Earth sciences. You'd also have alignment of chronostratigraphy with the Earth system community as well. As for the other science-centered disciplines, such as the physical geography, they would presumably, before long, with pressure from editors and so on, this would kind of automatically follow suit over time. Certainly the humanists would carry on using the Anthropocene the way they have always done. What would be the political consequence of this? Well, it would be an endorsement by the geoscience community that the Earth has changed its climate state. Basically, that we are now in uncharted territory on geological timescales, all beginning in the mid-20th century. What is the message for society? Well, wake up, we are in trouble. You know, we've already passed one critical threshold. Okay, now what if the Anthropocene is not approved, but the proposed GSSP, such as the Crawfordian, is approved? Well, this would be not good news. The practical consequences, well, essentially, at least the Anthropocene as an informal term would be tied to a GSSP, but it would be relegated as an informal term. But at least some improvement on the status quo. The political consequences, well, basically the humans haven't really that much changed the climate system. It's more or less kind of business as usual. We're still in the Holocene, not really such a big deal. So perhaps no need for dramatic correction in our management of the climate state. And the message for society, well, you know, maybe we haven't really entered a new climate state. And the worst possible outcome is that the Anthropocene epoch is not approved, nor its corresponding stage. So really we would be back to where we are now, back to square one, the Anthropocene as an informal unit with no real defined base. The practical consequences, well, the status quo. Political consequences, well, same as outcome number 2. You know, no big deal, nothing has really changed. And the message for society, well, no need to panic, there's no real crisis. And on that positive, happy note, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Tak, poznaliśmy kulisy grupy Antropocenu. Świetnie to tak, poznaliśmy.
Yes, so we have found out the backstage story of Anthropocene.
Dla mnie osobiście
To me personally, I was very inspiring, very novel.
jak pracuje taka grupa.
I had no idea how such a work group can actually operate. It turned out, which we found out at the ultimate part of the presentation, that the struggle for this ratification of Anthropocene as a proper notion is actually a struggle for our future. That's how we should actually respond to the crisis we're witnessing. I'm taken aback by this opposition, by this defiance also among geologists, defiance to admitting what we have done to the planet. That's actually stunning. There was a mention that 2023, that's where the watershed moment is coming, where everything will be decided. I'm also surprised how long it takes. Was it necessary to take that long, really? And do you believe in the success, in the very fact that the notion will be introduced with all the consequences into the proper nomenclature? Or that you just, have you just given up after so many years of struggle? Or do you still believe that 2023 will actually come with all the consequences of the change in the nomenclature?
Yes, that's very interesting, and I'm by nature I'm an optimist. I think most of us are, but I wanted to share these political consequences with you because I should say that the Anthropocene Working Group and all the other bodies of the International Commission on Stratigraphy are apolitical. There is no political agenda. We're basically looking at the Anthropocene to define it on strictly and exclusively geological terms, in terms of stratigraphy. But, the Anthropocene is different, and this was recognized by the chair of the International Commission on Stratigraphy back in 2015, Stan Finney, who said, the Anthropocene is different, and he was absolutely right. It's different because it is so recent. It represents the past 72 years. This is a blink of an eye in terms of geological time. So what's really crucial about understanding the Anthropocene is having an understanding about climate change and having confidence, and understanding produces confidence, having an understanding of climate modeling and of basic physics that tells us that with these extremely high levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, which, being realistic, are not going to dissipate anytime soon, even with, shall we say, in inverted commas, responsible stewardship, there is no way back. We have changed the climate state already. And looking at these projections into the future, it becomes clear that whether we make a decision next year after 73 years, or if we were to wait 100 years, or if we were to wait 1,000 or 10,000 years, the answer would still be the same, that we had fundamentally changed the Earth system state in the mid-20th century. So why not call it what it is? It would also align geology and chronostratigraphy with Earth system science, and it would allow the geological timescale to faithfully represent actual changes to the Earth system. These are the questions really that face, and these are the challenges that face the SQS, the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy. It needs to understand these issues in order to be able to process them and consider these issues when voting is undertaken. I'm not confident, I'm not supremely confident that the SQS will get the required supermajority decision, but this all depends on colleagues having open minds and in being willing to invest time into trying to understand the climate system. They are geologists, they're looking back in time. They're not used to grappling with physics, with modeling studies and so on. But they will have to do that if they are to make really a really informed decision. Whether that happens or not, we will just have to wait and see.
Z tego co rozumiem, toczy się walka.
Czy mógłby pan założyć zestaw do tłumaczenia?
Z tego co rozumiem, toczy się walka.
As far as I understand, there is the, struggle for human minds. And a struggle for some new narrative that is supposed to shake us to the bone and force us to change. And as far as this narrative is concerned, we can see geologists entering this sphere, entering this narrative. However, it was proposed many a time before. There are massive numbers of different scientific reports, publications that claim that we live in a very unique times of threat. And we know that the most important ones are related to climate changes and biodiversity decline. Do you think this narrative is actually functioning somewhere? I understand it is. I understand that geologists enter this narrative to give it even stronger voice. So it just keeps me wondering, as human being, as humanity, what else do we need to actually wake up from this slumber? Do we still have not enough data to actually see that, as some put, that we are threatened by extinction even? What is there if this decision that you're talking about that is really made in Anthropocene is really recognized as an epoch? Will it actually change anything, since There is so much evidence
bardzo źle i że
for, well, the situation being well bad, for this being actually the verge of catastrophe. Will it change anything in reality?
I'm sort of reminded of big tobacco and how it was so successful in marketing the notion that we're not really sure about the effects, the negative effects of tobacco on human health. We need more research. Well, you know, we didn't need more research, but the powers that be and politicians and so on were willing, for whatever reason, to buy into that particular distorted narrative. I hope this doesn't play out again with climate change. It has been for too long, and I think there is an inertia. I think there's a nobody wants to face an unpleasant future. I've heard that the Dutch, who are, of course, more acutely facing a crisis than anyone else as a nation because of most of their country is at or even below sea level, they have sort of assumed that their government is going to kind of take care of everything, however that will happen. I think people don't really, the average person just wants to get on with their daily lives. They don't want to think about these kind of catastrophes and disasters until they start to really bite, and then of course it's too late. So we do need, we need politicians, we need activists, and we need people who can change opinion. Now, in the world of geoscience, we're just scientists. We're just kind of doing our best, and we're just trying to explain things as we see them. I can only say, as I've mentioned before, that we are apolitical. We're not trying to make any political statements here, but it would be surely naive not to anticipate that there will be political consequences for the decisions that we make. And as I've said before, you know, if we don't formalize the Anthropocene on the basis of really what it stands for, a change in climate state, then we will be essentially denying the narrative that, as far as I'm concerned, exists, which is that we have departed from the natural variability of the Holocene and essentially of our planet as the result, as it happens, as a result of human pressures. Now, they happen to be human pressures. It could be any other species. It just happens to be humans. But the other thing to bear in mind is that we're not really, I don't think we should be framing this in terms of, at least as far as the geosciences are concerned, this is not so much to do with human impacts on the planet. This is more to do with the planetary response to those impacts. Now, as geologists, we are in a unique position to be able to look back in geological time. And we can say, as geologists with some credibility, that we have changed the planet into a state that we haven't seen for several millions of years. This is a big deal. Earth scientists are able to share that perspective with the rest of society. It's a privilege that we have, but it's also a responsibility. And we need to take that responsibility very, very carefully. We need to make the right decisions based on the right kind of information, but it requires something very different from us. It requires us to understand the future as well as the past. And as geologists, we're not used to doing this. And so this is a challenge for everybody in the decision-making community that I belong to. We need to be able to understand and have confidence in climate change and these climate projections.
Right. Well, it seems that I see some sadness in your words, that we are unsure of what might happen and in 2023 and what the effects of the working group will be. However, you actually keep holding your position, and you've come here to talk to us. And what do you believe has been the greatest success of yours in this area? What makes you happy as far as your achievements are concerned? Could you let us in on the kind of behind the scenes of your scientific work and tell us about your discoveries that perhaps have surprised you?
Well, I can't say the surprises have necessarily been positive. But I live in hope, like the rest of us. I'm a little surprised at the resistance of some of my colleagues within the geoscience community to engage in some of these discussions about the Anthropocene and climate change and future scenarios. I don't think they really understand that the Anthropocene is so different from some of these other intervals of geological time that we usually tackle. The Anthropocene is not the only thing that I'm involved with. I'm also involved in defining the base of the late Pleistocene. These are sort of, if you like, traditional challenges that my colleagues are able to face with commendable insight. But the Anthropocene is different, and it requires not different, but additional skill sets. And we need to be, we have to have an open mind, and we have to have, we have to be prepared to be intellectually creative and intellectually adventurous. I think this also comes perhaps with, people being perhaps younger in years, perhaps having been brought up in different societal circumstances. And so this may also be a kind of a generational thing as well. Maybe we need younger people on some of these committees. I think that might give us a different sort of outcome. And let me just say this also, and this is perhaps quite important. Any decision made within the committee structure I've just talked about cannot be revisited for 10 years. This is fair enough. It gives any decision 10 years of testing to see whether it works or not. It does mean, however, that however good or bad the decisions are next year, there will be an opportunity in 10 years to revisit these questions and to revisit these definitions. By then, in 10 years' time, people will have retired. There will be new blood on these committees. And so things may be different. Again, I remain an optimist.
Yeah, so you are saying that we need new blood on these committees. We need young people who are open-minded to make these changes happen. At the same time, as we sit here, well, it doesn't seem that we are that young. Perhaps we are open-minded. I really want to believe this. In any case, we are the promoters of this change, which is crucial for us to survive, and so are you. You have also been promoting this new story, this new narrative, so to speak. And so how did it happen that you embarked on this journey? What inspired you? What made you develop this commitment, despite the gray hair and the academic position, which you might just capitalize on this and just settle down, but you want to do more, to do something that goes beyond the area of geology as a science. So what makes you do that? How did it all come about?
Well, I was chair of the subcommission on quaternary stratigraphy for 8 years. This was back about, starting about, 12, 15 years ago. And I think it was 2 4-year terms, and I think it was maybe entering the beginning of my second term. The Anthropocene Working Group had been set up by my predecessor, and I hadn't really paid much attention to the Anthropocene Working Group. It was doing its own thing. It was taking a long time to make progress, and the reason I understand now is because it needed to develop the narrative before it could really begin the process of trying to define the Anthropocene. You see, most of these boundaries in geology have long histories, they have long antecedents, and we're really just coming along and we are defining based on a pre-existing narrative. But with the Anthropocene, this was an evolving narrative. We didn't really fully understand what was going on in terms really of climate change or in terms of the stratigraphic signals. It was, the whole enterprise was evolving. And at some point, I decided, as chair of the SQS, I decided I needed to really find out more about the Anthropocene and the Anthropocene Working Group and what it was up to. And I was not positively predisposed to the Anthropocene Working Group because it had been taking a great deal of time for reasons that I then didn't quite understand. And again, I guess the prejudices of being a geoscientist and having to try to understand that that there is merit to describing the past 72 years, then it would have been maybe 68 years or so, of Earth history as a new epoch of geological time. This was really stretching things as far as I was concerned. I wanted to keep an open mind, and I didn't want to be discouraging, but at the same time, I couldn't see myself buying into this at all. So I sort of invited myself to one of these Anthropocene working groups, and I was invited to give a presentation from the SQS, the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy perspective. And I did this, and but the more I thought about the Anthropocene, and when you're trying to explain something to somebody else, it's only then that you really understand, you really know whether you understand what you're talking about or not. When you're trying to explain to somebody else what you think you know. And I was trying to explain the sort of conservative position, and I realized that this was not tenable. Actually, the Anthropocene Working Group had a point, and I kind of immersed myself in the work that they were doing, and I thought more and more about my opposition to a formalized Anthropocene, and my resistance just melted away the more I became immersed in the whole concept. So, it was a kind of a conversion by forcing myself to grapple with these issues and to try to understand, if you like, the the other side, the other arguments. But I forced myself to do this, and that's what we need to do. You have to be prepared to go outside of your comfort zone. I know you hear this so often. You hear this with entrepreneurs, but it's the same with science. You know, if you're going to make progress, you have to move outside of your comfort zone. You've got to be willing to do that, to take some discomfort.
Tak, to jeszcze kontynuując.
Okay, more on this note.
Przez chwilkę,
Just a couple of more questions.
czy w obliczu tej
Now,
sytuacji
facing this situation that the human civilization is facing,
klimatolodzy, ekolodzy,
climate scientists, ecologists, human science experts, applied scientists, should they all become activists and try to display this proactive approach? I'm asking you about it because I've recently read an article from
nam nic nie pozostało.
acclaimed scientists who claim that there was nothing else to be done to scientists than simply to display civic disobedience. As we were talking about Anthropocene, about the very notion of Anthropocene, in a broader perspective, there are numerous voices from scientists who show results of the research, not just what's happening in rock mass, but what's basically happening in the atmosphere, in nature. I don't know if you heard about this ecological catastrophe in the River Oder in Poland. That's a very topical thing in Poland. Scientists actually know how to solve certain problem, whilst the decision makers, the politicians, see this completely otherwise. Two disparate worlds, completely dissociated. Scientists saying something about the measures and remedies, and politicians not listening to them by definition. It feels to me that this dissonance is but going deeper and deeper. What do you think about that? Yes, there is research, we are studying, we are talking, but there is more to be done, right?
Yes and no. No, I don't think that as scientists, certainly as members of the working groups and subcommissions and so on that I've been talking about, no, I don't think it's appropriate for us to act as activists. We are doing a job, and we need to do that job as objectively as possible. It's only by doing our work as scientists objectively, by looking at the facts and interpreting them in a sound fashion, that we are really going to maintain the credibility that I hope we have. This is not we're not trying to follow a political agenda here. We're trying to understand the climate system, and by understanding the climate system, then we're making judgment calls on the way we classify geological time. In this case, going forward as well as backwards in geological time. This is strictly science. So no, I don't think we should be activists. All power to the activists, because society needs activists. But I don't think blurring those lines really helps very much. What we do need to be doing as scientists is communicating our science better to the general public and to politicians. We need to accept that there are political consequences to our decisions. We're not here to defend our political views. It's just not our job to do this. And if we were to wade into the political arena, I think it would damage our credibility of ourselves and of our colleagues. So I would not recommend that at all. But there are consequences, political consequences. We have to be aware. Societal consequences. We have to be aware of those. We have to do a better job of communicating our science to the general public and to politicians so that they can understand what this means for the future of our planet and what the messaging means as well. And so we leave that to the politicians and to the activists, and all power to you.
I asked about it as well, because the World Scientist Warning to Humanity was released. Then there was this, well, heated dispute in different journals and papers, and it turned out that people that make informed decisions, scientists that do study things, that know the consequences, the conclusion was that if they hadn't entered the world of politics, the political decisions wouldn't have changed, or actually would not change. There was some, attempt to encourage scientists to actually enter the world of politics. So I understand that, well, you're suggesting that we should focus on scientific research instead of going deeper into politics. I suppose to all scientists that's an unsolvable dilemma, wouldn't you say?
Well, as I've said before, I think when you enter the field of politics, you're entering into the field of ideology and of rhetoric, perhaps personal ambition, alignment with other political groups. You blur the boundary between objective evidence-based science and, the great and wonderful human endeavor of politics and so on. And I think it's important to maintain that distinction, because by maintaining that distinction, in a sense, you keep objective science above the fray. But I've said before, it's important that the scientists are able to communicate exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it, and why they have made the decisions that they've made. And it's very important also for politicians, activists and so on, to listen to the scientists and to take on board really what they're saying. I think there needs to be more communication with science and the rest of society. This is not a new revelation. I mean, we're being encouraged to engage in social outreach all the time. Certainly in Canada, my funding agency in Canada is constantly telling us that we need to go out and explain to the public what we are doing and why. One of the reasons for that is that it is the public who are funding the research in the first place, so they deserve to know what we are doing and why. And so we need to do a better job of this kind of thing. But, when you start blurring the subjective and the politically motivated, the politically aligned with objective science, then I think that diminishes the authority of science itself.
More on this note, if you don't mind, because scientists tend to say that a human being is a geological force. Now, the question is the following. Is this fact subject to some moral judgment? Is it possible that science in contemporary times is devoid of any values as such, compared to science of the turn of the 19th century? Can science be devoid of values nowadays?
Well, I mean, scientists are humans as well, so we follow life by our own ethical codes. But of course, there are scientific ethical codes that we have to follow as well. More acutely, perhaps in the world of genetics, and where human subjects are involved. You might argue, I suppose, that the planet itself is even more important than a human subject. It's actually, 8 billion human subjects. So yes, I mean, we do have we all, of course, have our own personal responsibilities for the planet and for the planet's stewardship. And we do have, I mean, I understand what you're saying. It's difficult to draw a sharp line between objective science, and if you like, a political agenda. It's very difficult to draw a sharp line between the two. I suppose I can only speak for myself. I'm not really a political animal. I'm really more of an analytical type. But I do understand the consequences, for example, of climate change, and it does trouble me personally. I suppose I wouldn't be here if I didn't have a kind of a sense of responsibility for explaining what we do as scientists and what the political consequences are, which I showed in the last maybe 4 or 5 slides of my talk. I guess that probably is some evidence that I do feel a kind of personal engagement in, the responsibility that we have for our planet. But I'm also aware professionally that there are certain limits to how far we as scientists, especially if we are representing specific scientific bodies tasked with a specific responsibility, I'm very much aware that there are limits that I have to abide by as well.
Nie wiem, czy Państwo już czekacie.
I'm sure you're impatiently waiting for an opportunity to ask a question. Sorry for taking so long a time, but we really do want to give you the opportunity to ask some questions. Yes, we are going to be approached with a microphone. That's obviously necessary. And alternately, you will ask a question and a question from Facebook. So just raise your hand and you will be approached with a microphone now. When is the next glacial epoch anticipated? Will there be any next glacial epoch? And would it, according to you, close the Anthropocene epoch?
This is a very good and critically important issue. Normally, I could answer this question on a number of different levels, but normally we would be entering a new glacial stage fairly soon. We are already 11,700 years into the present interglacial, which we call the Holocene. Now, these glacial intervals are largely controlled by Milankovitch cyclicity. And Milankovitch cyclicity doesn't involve a single cyclical forcing. It's complicated. We happen to be living in what's called a low eccentricity state, which means that it would require quite low levels of CO2 for us to actually go into the next glacial state. And that is definitely not going to happen. In fact, we probably crossed that threshold around 7,000 years ago. We are, in terms of insolation from the sun, we've been receiving less and less insolation since about, 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. We're receiving less and less insolation from the sun. Normally we would be hitting a threshold fairly soon that would be plunging us into the next glaciation, a glacial inception. But because CO2 levels are so high, In fact, they were rising, they've been rising for about 7,000 years. And there are arguments as to whether that is natural or whether it's been aided by farming and so on. We're still not quite sure why those CO2 levels started to rise about 7,000 years ago. But that rise is nothing compared with the rise in CO2 levels that have been occurring since around 1950. And those CO2 levels continue to rise. And it is these very, very high levels of CO2 that prohibit the Earth system state from entering a glaciation for the next glaciation or probably the next one after that. We are talking about the next 50 or 100,000 years of interglacial state. This is, there are no parallels to this over the past 2.6 million years or more. So we really have entered a different climate state. And you only have to look at the physics. You don't even need to look at modeling projections. Just look at the basic physics to understand that we can't possibly get back into a glacial state with these incredibly elevated CO2 levels. But it's the physics and it's the climate model projections that are telling us that we have moved into a new climate state, a new Earth system state, not just a climate state, a new Earth system state. And geologists, geoscientists are not used to looking into the future, and that's really where the difficulties arise in making decisions, formal decisions about a geological period of time which traditionally involves only looking backwards in time.
Tak, Basiu, pytania z internetu. Zapraszamy.
Tak, jestem już połączona. Dobry wieczór.
Yes, I'm online.
The first question we have from Professor Ewa Bińczyk from Toruń, University of Toruń. My question to Professor Head: how do you perceive the possible political role and methodological legitimacy of the research concerning planetary boundaries? Are they more influential than the discussion concerning Anthropocene's formal introduction?
I didn't really hear that.
Once again?
Czy nie słyszał pan profesor dokładnie?
Question is entirely. Tak, to pytanie w języku angielskim. Pani profesor Ewa Bińczyk zapytała po angielsku.
English.
The question is in English, so you can listen to.
Yeah, the question is in
Basia, we
English from Professor Ewa Bińczyk from University of Toruń. Is it okay now?
Let me see if I can hear. Okay, let's try again.
Okay. How do you perceive the possible political role and methodological legitimacy of the research concerning planetary boundaries? Are they more influential than the discussion concerning Anthropocene's formal introduction?
I'm not sure I really caught that question, but
Nie jestem pewien, czy zrozumiałem dokładnie to pytanie.
are critically important. They are important to our understanding of Earth history and our classification of Earth history. And that's sort of interesting because if we were to, I've showed you the geological timescale. Probably the crowning achievement of 19th century geology was the geological timescale. And by the time we got to the end of the 19th century, we had a timescale that we would recognize today. Okay, it's been refined and we now have numbers that have been inserted into the boundaries, but the timescale is not much changed. And the timescale remains conservative. Now, geologists in the past were, to the best of their abilities, trying to understand climate change and how the Earth had functioned and changed as a system. They used fossils primarily to do this. By looking at the fossils, they were trying to understand Earth history. But the thing is that now, if we were to look back over Earth history, knowing what we know now, we would rewrite the geological timescale. If we could just start from scratch, we would have a timescale that looked very different from how it looks now. But we can't do that because we need to maintain continuity with the past literature. And so we are somewhat constrained. We do try to, well, the timescale tries to do two things. It tries to abide by a narrative, and that narrative involves planetary boundaries and changes to the Earth system. It tries to reflect that, but it is also constrained by historical usage of terms. It would be no good if it was suddenly decided that you know, the Jurassic isn't really warranted on the basis of our modern understanding of Earth systems. And so we get rid of it and we extend the Cretaceous downwards, or whatever we would do. It would break our, because we're also using the geological timescale for practical purposes. We're using it for description. So back in the 19th century, people were describing rocks from the Jurassic. Well, if we were to stop using the term Jurassic, well, then we go back through the literature and we would suddenly, we'd break that link with the literature. So there is a natural conservatism built into the geological timescale and the way we change it. So the timescale does its best, I would say, to reflect planetary change. But it is also constrained to a certain degree by historical tradition. But let me just say this. The timescale is a practical device. It is a practical tool. It allows us to take rocks from around the world that can be correlated together and then described by a single term, such as Jurassic or Cretaceous or Holocene or whatever. The reason we can often do that, and the reason we can do that effectively, is because if we have chosen boundaries that reflect a planetary boundary, then the geology itself changes, and the geological expression, the sedimentological expression, changes on a global scale. So then it makes it easier. It makes more sense then to use those geological terms if they are basically constrained by planetary change. At the end of the day, as I've said before, these units of the geological timescale are chronostratigraphic. They have isochronous tops and bases. And these isochronous tops and bases happen and are best expressed if they are driven by planetary change. Does that answer your question?
That was question from...
To było pytanie.
Teraz czas na...
Tak, zapraszamy.
Tak. Dzień dobry.
Yes, hello, Jacek Baraniak. About anthropogenic climate change, and I'm actually in the Facebook group on anthropogenic change, climate change, and the environment. I'm a member of the Workshop for All Beings. That's an environmentalist organization. So, as a geological epoch, since there was Pleistocene after Pliocene, then after Pleistocene there should be Anthropocene, right? And not Holocene. Because in that case, this would be only an interglacial interval, right? We have glacial and interglacial alternating.
Yes, you are in some ways correct. The Holocene is in some ways just another interglacial. And there are very many interglacials in the Quaternary. So the geological timescale contains, if you like, some historical baggage. And you could describe the Holocene, the way it's singled out as a special unit of time, indeed at a high rank, the rank of epoch, is because of this historical baggage. So where does the Holocene come about? Well, it really began with Charles Lyell, who was subdividing the Cenozoic, the last 66 million years of Earth history. He was subdividing it, and he got to the end, the sort of recent, if you like, recent deposits, and rather than give them, these recent deposits, a special designated name, he just said, we'll call them recent with a capital R, to signify that these are post-Pleistocene or post-Pliocene deposits. So for a long time, these more modern deposits were known as recent. In particular, Lyell described these recent deposits as being the interval of time tenanted by man. So there was something special, as far as Charles Lyell was concerned, about humans and the most recent interval of geological time. Well, of course, you know, this was a scriptural narrative going on here. At that time, Charles Lyell was, you know, was a devout Christian, and to him it was very important that you distinguished an interval of time tenanted by man as being something special. So that was how the recent came about. Around about, or shortly afterwards, the term Holocene came into being, although the term just sort of crept in almost bureaucratically. And it wasn't really until fairly recently that it became clear that the way things would work best would be if the Holocene, the term Holocene, were to replace the Quaternary. But by this time, the recent, or the Holocene, was then understood to simply be the last, the present interglacial. So it's kind of historical baggage. And if it weren't for Charles Lyell singling out his recent as being the time tenanted by man, we probably wouldn't have a Holocene. The Pleistocene would then continue to the present day. So this is, if you like, historical baggage. I might just say that we'd also use the term Quaternary. And the Quaternary is the next rank up. It is a period or a system of a period of geological time. And the Quaternary is quite a useful concept. The Quaternary follows the Paleogene and the Neogene. It represents a time interval when we entered a major glacial state, if you like. Well, if we didn't have the Holocene, we wouldn't have the Quaternary, because if the Pleistocene ran to the present day, then the Quaternary would be redundant. But because the Pleistocene and the Holocene are both epochs together, they are then kind of, lumped into the Quaternary. So, there is a bit of a happy ending here, but because I happen to think that the Quaternary is a useful term. Yes, there is really nothing that special about the last interglacial.
Pytanie od dr Magdaleny
A question by Magdalena Ochwat, PhD from University of Silesia.
jest rola przedstawicieli nauk humanistycznych.
What is the role of representatives of the humanities and of the fine arts in transmitting knowledge about climate change, Anthropocene, and Earth?
Well, this is where it becomes complicated, isn't it? Because there are multiple Anthropocenes out there, depending upon your discipline. If you are a humanist, for you, the Anthropocene is really defined by thought process and evolution of thought processes, and the notion of a chronostratigraphic Anthropocene that is has a sharply defined base. This is very constraining and actually quite unhelpful if you are using the term Anthropocene in a very different context with a very different definition. I'm not sure that it's terribly helpful that we have all these different definitions for the one term. I think it would be more helpful if we had different terms for different, albeit overlapping, concepts. I'd be interested to know what the humanists think of the chronostratigraphic Anthropocene, but I can be fairly sure that while they respect our position, they don't find it very helpful for them. So in terms of these other disciplines, I would like to know what they would have to say about an Anthropocene that marks out as something very special the events that took place in the 20th century. I do know that there are some historians out there that like the idea of a chronostratigraphic Anthropocene, because as historians they really do see a change that took place. I mean, John McNeill, who came out with the term, the Great Acceleration, he was a historian. So there are some historians who would buy into this wholeheartedly. Others would not. And social scientists and archaeologists would say, this is way too constraining. So I'm not sure really what kind of role people outside of Earth scientists would have in kind of, if you like, promoting the chronostratic Anthropocene. I'd be interested in comments from the audience about that.
Tak, pytania. Ja tak patrzę na zegarek.
I'm just having a look at the time. I suppose we should definitely take into account of the fact that our guest is, 2 hours on stage. So the question I have, is there any sudden factor such as a meteorite strike or a comet or a Third World War or the use of any weapon there is, biological, nuclear weapon, can it actually change those negative climate changes into other climate changes?
I think the important thing here is that, major bolide impacts aside, I think if there were a major bolide impact, a major comet or asteroid impact, if it were big enough, we wouldn't be around to worry about the timescale. We'd have more important things to worry about than whether we were in the Anthropocene or not. As far as you know, a nuclear war is concerned, I mean, we are living in an increased risk of a nuclear war. It would certainly have important consequences for our climate, but I would maintain that we had modified our climate system. I think that's the important thing. Modification of the climate system outside of, if you like, the normal functioning, the natural functioning of our climate system. So, yes, it might very well be that on some level, a nuclear winter, well, I'm not sure how long a nuclear winter would last for, it would certainly cool down the planet, but it would have other consequences as well. But again, I would contend that, you know, any of these non-natural non-natural impacts on our climate system would still constitute a change in trajectory from the normal into something different. Yep, so I think we'd still be in the Anthropocene. Maybe a second stage of the Anthropocene. Maybe out of the Crawfordian and into the, I don't know, the Ukrainian or something else.
Basiu, proponujemy ostatni.
Which suggests the very last question from the net. Okay, so I'm picking one of the three, actually. So a question from YouTube, because there hasn't been any. Best regards to you, Professor, from Barbara Fijołkiewicz-Kozioł from Poznań, along with a question. So, I'd like to ask you about other epochs against the skepticism of geologists when announcing Anthropocene. One of the arguments being that whereas the synchronic signal, research error, is it that we can actually recognize the same chromostratigraphic signal and scale everywhere?
I think in short, yeah, the answer is yes, we can, because we are dealing with a planetary response. So therefore, I think we see changes to the climate. Of course, sea level and many of these impacts are actually global. In terms of a synchronous signal, the most promising one is the plutonium-239-240 signal, which has a global distribution. That's not to say that it has actually necessarily an impact on the climate state. It is just simply a stratigraphic signal, but nonetheless, it is a practical tool for recognizing Anthropocene strata, not anthropogenic, Anthropocene strata around the world. Impacts are going to be, or will have been, great acceleration had different impacts on different parts of the planet. But there were nonetheless impacts around the planet synchronously, all occurring at the same time around the mid-20th century. And of course, these impacts are continuing to the present day. So this is really the, and will continue into the future, if you believe climate science. So this really is actually, so climate science really is under scrutiny here as well. Physics and projections based on climate modeling. This is all under scrutiny. But yes, I'm kind of losing track of the original question. I hope I've answered it. But yes, the great acceleration, it must have had, I mean, I don't have personal experience, but it was a planetary change. So it will have had planetary, global, worldwide consequences that can be seen in the geological record.
Tak, my mamy jeszcze króciutkie.
One more very short question here from us, a kind of a joint question, if you will, concerning the Earth. Is there any place that you treat as your favorite place on Earth, that you love, that you really like to be there? If there was, what sort of place would that be? Can we learn about your most favorite place on Earth?
So is this before or after World War III? It does make a difference. Well, there are so many wonderful places on this planet. I've had the very good fortune in my job of being able to travel very, very widely. And it's really difficult to pinpoint one particular kind of magical place. There are so many of them. I was quite recently, just this summer, I was in Bergen, and Bergen is it was for an international paleoceanography conference, the 14th International Paleoceanography Conference. Now, this is not a plug for Bergen, by the way. I don't get 10% commission for plugging Bergen here, but Bergen is a beautiful city. It's one of the Hanseatic ports, so it's got a long sort of medieval history and so on. It rains most of the time, but it's surrounded by mountains. And you can be in the city center, and within an hour, you can be up in the mountains, way away from anywhere. Now, of course, when it's raining, it's not even worth going up into the mountains because you wouldn't see anything. But I just happened to be in Bergen while the weather was amazing. And I went up into the mountains, and you could see for miles and miles. You could even see glaciers off into the distance. So I would say that was a pretty special place. But you have to be really lucky with the weather.
I do confirm. I confirm. Beautiful place Bergen is. A lot of different corners of Norway are quite pretty, aren't they? I think it's high time that we close this inspiring, mostly interesting, but not only interesting, but also stimulating meeting, filled with a lot of emotions, insights, a meeting that gave us a lot of food for thought. We are deeply and profoundly grateful to all of you, madams, that you came up with this idea to organize this, and to you, Professor, that you decided, that you allowed us to be our 78th guest and visitor and interlocutor. Thank you for your presentation, your insight, for your proactive approach to all the questions. Thank you so much.
In return, I'd like to thank you all very much in the audience for listening to me, and especially from all those questions. I'd like to thank you two for hosting this and for moderating a really interesting discussion event afterwards. It's been really terrific. A special call out also to the translator over there in the special cubicle, who did a fantastic job with sort of real-time translation. Must be the most difficult job in the world. I hope this person is getting paid a lot of money for doing this.
Yes, thank you, Marcin. Thank you, everybody, for being with us here. And obviously, you're most invited to another meeting in 6 days. There will be yet another meeting. So quite densely compacted and densely packed events. You'll be welcome to join us at the University Library and Science Center, Sinida. I suppose you're all familiar with this place. We will have representatives of the Wild Carpathian Initiative. We're going to talk about Poland a little bit more, about wildlife of Poland. And the Turnicki National Park. So, all the best to all of you, and see you slightly later. And please return your translation headsets. The things that you have on your heads and ears, don't take them to homes. And one more thing, once you return them, we can have a photo together here next to the stage. So first return the headsets and then join us next to the stage.